The desperate message. The Zontar homeworld was a peaceful planet, full of lush forests and clear blue skies. For centuries, the Zontar people lived in harmony, their only concern being the care of their natural surroundings. They were a gentle species, with no history of war or violence. But now, everything had changed. A terrible enemy was coming. The Zontar had received no warning. One day, their advanced technology, which was meant for peaceful exploration and communication, picked up a strange signal from deep in space. It was a warning from another planet. The Zontar didn't understand much, but they knew one thing. Their entire world was in danger. At first, the Zontar hoped it was just a misunderstanding. But as the days went by, the situation grew worse. The signal wasn't a one-time transmission. It was a constant barrage of threats and commands. A ruthless race of beings, known as the Vrox, was coming for them. The Vrox had a history of conquering peaceful planets, wiping out entire civilizations with no mercy. The Zontar people had never faced anything like this before. In their desperation, the Zontar turned to their greatest invention, the galaxy-wide communication system. It was designed to send messages across the universe in the hope of finding help in times of need. But the Zontar had never imagined they would use it for such a dire reason. The leaders of the Zontar met in their great council hall, a large round chamber with towering windows that looked out over the vast green fields below. The room was filled with tension. There was no time left to waste. "It's our only option," said Kayla, one of the oldest and wisest members of the council. "If we don't send a call for help, we will be destroyed. The Vrox are too powerful for us to fight on our own. We have to hope someone answers." "But who will hear us?" asked Corin, a younger member of the council, his voice filled with doubt. "The universe is vast. How will anyone even know where to find us? And what if the wrong people hear our call?" Kayla's gaze was firm. "We don't have a choice. We must send the message, or we will be lost." With that, the decision was made. The Zontar activated their galaxy-wide communication system, sending a desperate call into the depths of space. The message was clear. "Help. The Vrox are coming. We cannot survive alone. Please, someone help us." They didn't know who would receive it. They didn't know if anyone would answer. But they had no other option. The message was sent. It traveled across the stars, bouncing from one relay station to the next. Across galaxies and star systems, it spread like a ripple in the water. The Zontar waited. Hours passed. Then days. The tension in the air grew thick, and every Zontar on the planet wondered if they would ever see another sunrise. But far away, beyond the farthest reaches of the Zontar homeworld, something stirred. The message had been received. It wasn't by the peaceful races the Zontar had hoped for. It wasn't by anyone who could help them in the way they needed. The call had reached the ears of the Deathworlders. The Deathworlders were a group of ruthless, war-hardened species known for their violent history and fierce survival instincts. They lived on planets that no one else could survive on, where even the toughest species would perish. They had no love for peace, and they certainly didn't care about helping weak, peaceful species. Yet, when the call for help echoed in the vastness of space, something about it caught the attention of their fleet. Captain Varek, the leader of the Deathworlder fleet, was a tall, imposing figure with sharp eyes and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He had fought in countless battles across the galaxy, and the last thing he wanted was to waste his time on a weak species like the Zontar. But there was something strange about the message. The desperation in the Zontar's plea was different from anything he had ever encountered. It wasn't just a call for help. It was a cry for survival. Varek's fingers hovered over the controls of his ship, his eyes scanning the data. The Zontar had no military strength, no ability to defend themselves against the Vrox. Yet something in the message resonated with him. Maybe it was the challenge. Maybe it was the idea of a species that had never fought, now desperate for help. Whatever it was, Captain Varek knew he had to make a decision. "Prepare the fleet," he commanded. "We'll answer this call." His officers looked at each other in surprise. The Deathworlder fleet was known for dealing with threats in their own way. They were not saviors. They did not offer mercy. But Captain Varek's decision was final. The Zontar were about to find out what it meant to be rescued by the Deathworlders. The Zontar had no idea who would be coming to their aid, nor did they understand the consequences of their call. They simply held on to the hope that someone, anyone, would answer. They didn't know the Deathworlders, or the price that would come with their help. As the days passed, the Zontar watched the skies, hoping for a sign. Would their plea for help be heard? And if it was, who would come? In the farthest reaches of space, a fleet of massive ships, built for war, began to move toward the Zontar homeworld. The fate of the Zontar was about to change forever. The response of the Deathworlders. The stars outside Captain Varek's command ship flickered like distant flames in the vastness of space. His eyes scanned the holographic display in front of him, which showed the progress of the fleet as they neared the Zontar homeworld. The journey had been long, but the silence was heavier than anything the Deathworlder fleet had ever experienced before. It was as if the entire galaxy was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The Zontar's distress signal had been unlike any message Captain Varek had received in his years of leading the fleet. It wasn't the usual message of a planet begging for rescue, nor was it a cry for help from a species looking to defend itself. No, this signal was different. The desperation in the Zontar's voice had pierced through the cold, empty spaces of space itself. It was a message that spoke of survival, of an entire race on the brink of extinction. Varek wasn't sure why he had decided to respond. The Zontar were weak, pacifist beings who had no place in the harsh universe of the Deathworlders. They had no weapons, no armies, no way of protecting themselves against the Vroks, a race known for their ruthless conquests. Yet, despite the Zontar's lack of military might, something about their call had stirred something in Varek. Maybe it was the idea of a species that had never fought, never known war, now faced with the annihilation of everything they held dear. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because Varek knew that the galaxy was full of species that had never known the power of the Deathworlders. Species that, like the Zontar, had lived in peace, naive and unaware of the brutal realities of space. In a way, they reminded him of the weak, untested races he had once encountered in his younger years. His mind flickered back to his early days in the Deathworlder fleet. Back then, he had fought in countless battles, learning the brutal ways of the galaxy. He had witnessed the fall of civilizations, the destruction of entire species, all at the hands of the Deathworlders. It was a cruel cycle, a cycle that Captain Varek had learned to accept until now. The fleet was nearing the Zontar planet now, and Varek could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He was about to do something he had never done before, intervene in a way that wasn't simply a fight or a conquest. He was about to offer help to a species that had never known war, a species that had no idea what kind of help the Deathworlders offered. "Prepare the fleet," Varek ordered. His voice was calm, but the underlying tension was clear. The officers around him quickly sprang into action, their faces tight with concentration. Every ship in the fleet was ready for war, equipped with weapons that could obliterate entire fleets in minutes. But this wasn't going to be a war, at least not in the traditional sense. As the fleet approached the planet, Varek's mind raced. What would he find when they arrived? The Zontar were a peaceful species, a race that had never been exposed to the brutal realities of the universe. Would they be frightened of the Deathworlders? Would they understand the kind of help that was about to be delivered to them? The fleet entered the Zontar system, and Varek ordered the ships to slow their approach. He watched as the peaceful planet came into view, a beautiful world of vast oceans, sprawling forests, and glowing cities. From afar, it looked serene, untouched by the chaos of the universe. But Varek knew better. Beneath the beauty of the planet lay a species that was unprepared for what was about to hit them. The Zontar's peaceful existence had made them vulnerable, and now the Deathworlders were going to show them just how fragile that peace really was. "Captain, we are in orbit," said one of the officers. The Zontar's communications have been opened. They know we are here. Varric nodded. He had expected this. The Zontar were probably watching from their cities, wondering what kind of response they would get. Would the Deathworlders help them, or would they bring even more destruction? Varric knew the answer to that. The Deathworlders were here to help, but not in the way the Zontar expected. The fleet was here to make sure the Vrox never threatened the Zontar again. The fleet was here to show the galaxy the true power of a species that had survived the harshest conditions the universe could throw at it. He gave the order for the ships to begin their descent to the planet's surface. As the Deathworlders prepared to land, Varric couldn't help but wonder how the Zontar would react. Would they welcome them with open arms, or would they fear the very help they had begged for? The Zontar had no idea what they were about to face. Their peaceful world was about to be thrust into the harsh reality of the galaxy. They were about to learn that in the universe, sometimes survival came at a price that would forever change the fate of their people. As the Deathworlder fleet began to land, Varric stood on the bridge of his ship, staring out at the beautiful but fragile planet below. The Zontar had called for help, and now they would get it. But what they didn't know was that their lives, their world, and their future were about to be irrevocably altered. The galaxy was watching, and the Deathworlders were ready to make their mark. The journey begins. The silence of space was broken by the hum of the Deathworlder fleet as it began its final approach to the Zontar homeworld. For the Zontar, the wait had been agonizing. Each passing day seemed to stretch into eternity as they anxiously watched the skies, uncertain of who or what would come in response to their desperate plea. The peaceful race of Zontar had never imagined that the day they would face extinction would also be the day their world would be visited by a force more terrifying than any nightmare. For the Deathworlders, however, this journey was something entirely different. It was a test, one that would reveal whether or not they would intervene in the lives of another species. Captain Varric stood at the helm of the fleet's flagship, his eyes narrowed as he studied the approach to the planet below. His mind was calculating the strategy for the coming days, but it wasn't just the tactical decisions that weighed on him. There was something else, something deeper that tugged at him, though he couldn't quite place it. Captain, his second in command, Commander Rock, spoke up from behind him. "We are entering the planet's orbit. Should we initiate communications with the Zontar?" Varric didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the shimmering blue and green world below them. It looked like a paradise, a far cry from the hostile planets the Deathworlders called home. He couldn't help but wonder what had driven the Zontar to such desperation. But there was no time for wondering. He had made the decision to act, and now the moment of truth was upon them. "No," Varric said, finally breaking the silence. "We proceed without contact for now. Let the Zontar come to us. We will give them no chance to refuse help. Prepare the fleet for descent. We will land within the hour." As the fleet descended toward the surface of the Zontar homeworld, Varric's mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. He had never been one for mercy, and he knew the Deathworlders' arrival would send ripples through the galaxy. The Zontar were weak, but they were not foolish. They had made their plea for help, and they had summoned the Deathworlders. There was no turning back now. The ships of the Deathworlder fleet, massive and imposing, sliced through the atmosphere like shadows. As they drew closer to the planet's surface, the Zontar, from their cities and villages, saw the ships descending from the skies. Panic began to spread. The people of Zontar had never seen such monstrous ships, had never encountered anything like the Deathworlders who now loomed over them. The Zontar had expected help, but not in the way they were about to receive it. They had imagined peaceful allies arriving, perhaps beings of similar demeanor to themselves. They had never considered the possibility that their call would be answered by the most fearsome fleet in the galaxy. On the ground, the Zontar were in turmoil. Their leaders, who had gathered in a great hall to discuss the situation, looked out at the descending fleet with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "They're here," Kayla, the elder councilwoman, whispered, her voice trembling. She was the one who had pushed for sending the call for help, and now she was faced with the consequences. She had hoped the Deathworlders would bring salvation, but their ships, dark, towering, and full of power, made her question whether she had made the right decision. "We've done all we can," Corin, the younger councilman, said with a resigned tone. He stood by Kayla's side, watching as the fleet descended closer to the ground. The Zontar had prepared themselves for the worst, but nothing could have prepared them for the true terror of the Deathworlder presence. The ships landed with a thundering force, and the ground beneath them trembled as if the planet itself were quaking in fear. In the heart of the fleet, Captain Varric stood ready. His fleet had now landed on the surface of Zontar, and the time for waiting was over. It was time to make contact. The Deathworlders did not negotiate. They didn't offer terms or make promises. They acted. "Deploy the ground forces," Varric commanded. His voice was cold and commanding, carrying the weight of a leader who had been through countless battles. "Take control of the landing zones. Secure the perimeter." The Deathworlders were a force to be reckoned with. Their warriors were brutal, armored giants who were trained for combat in the harshest environments. These were not soldiers who fought for glory or honor. They'd fought for survival. And survival was what the Zontar needed, though they didn't know it yet. As the Deathworlder troops disembarked from the ships, the Zontar gathered in their cities, unsure of what to do. There was no one among them who could challenge the overwhelming might of the Deathworlders. The Zontar had never seen such advanced weaponry, never witnessed such raw power. The streets were flooded with confusion and fear as the first Deathworlder soldiers marched into their cities. Kayla and Corin, along with other leaders, gathered in a central meeting hall. The room was filled with the sound of murmurs and whispered prayers. The Zontar were a peaceful people, not accustomed to violence, and the mere presence of the Deathworlders made them feel helpless. They had sent a call for aid, but they hadn't imagined that this was what they would receive. "We have to meet them," Kayla said, her voice trembling. "We must speak with them. Try to understand why they've come. Perhaps they will show mercy." Corin looked at her, his face etched with concern. "Mercy. These beings are not known for their mercy. If anything, we may have brought ruin upon ourselves." As the Zontar leaders gathered to discuss their next steps, the Deathworlder fleet's commanding officers began their strategic planning. Varric, standing on the command deck of his ship, looked down at the planet's surface. He knew that the Zontar were terrified, but they had made their choice. They had called for help, and now they would see the price of survival. The Zontar were about to experience the power of the Deathworlders in a way they never expected. What would happen next? Would the Zontar accept the help they had so desperately sought, or would they reject the harsh reality that came with it? The journey was only just beginning. Arrival at Zontar. The heavy thud of Deathworlder boots echoed through the newly established landing zones. The ground trembled beneath the might of their ships as they made contact with Zontar's surface. The peaceful planet, which had once been a beacon of tranquility, now felt the oppressive weight of an invading force. From above, the beautiful, lush landscapes of Zontar looked almost untouched, but the planet's beauty could not mask the sense of impending doom that lingered in the air, like a storm on the horizon. Captain Varric stood at the forefront of the fleet's command ship, his expression unreadable. The planet beneath them was peaceful, its inhabitants kind and gentle, yet they were about to face something far harsher than anything they had ever known. The Deathworlders' presence on Zontar was not just a show of force, it was a reckoning. Varric had seen the way the Zontar trembled when they first saw the fleet descending toward them. They were unarmed, unsure of what to make of the Deathworlders. For the first time, he wondered if his decision had been the right one. The Zontar had called for help, but they had never asked for this. This overwhelming power, this strength that could easily break them. "Commander Rock," Varric said, his voice low but firm, "make sure the perimeter is secured. We do not know how the Zontar will react, but we must be prepared for anything." Rock nodded, his eyes hard as he turned to relay the orders. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the Zontar, but he had also seen something else, a strange mixture of hope and dread. They didn't know what kind of help they had summoned, but there was no turning back now. Meanwhile, on the surface of Zontar, the inhabitants were gathered in a central hall. It was their largest gathering place, a vast structure with sweeping windows that overlooked the planet's breathtaking landscapes. Kayla, the wise councilwoman, stood at the front, looking out at the landing zone. Her heart was heavy. The ships, those enormous war machines that had descended from the sky, were a terrifying sight. She knew they had no choice but to meet the Deathworlders. But what would they say? How could they even begin to communicate with these beings who were so far beyond anything the Zontar had ever encountered? Corin, younger and more optimistic, stood beside her. His brow furrowed as he watched the Deathworlder soldiers move through the landing zone with methodical precision. They had no hesitation, no fear. Their steps were purposeful and confident, and they appeared to move with the same cold efficiency that came from years of training in hostile environments. "Do you think we made a mistake?" Corin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We called for help, but now I wonder if we've called down something worse." Kayla's face was stern, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "We didn't know what the consequences would be, Corin. All we knew was that the Vroks were coming, and without help, we wouldn't survive. Now we must face the consequences of that choice." The doors of the hall opened, and the rest of the council entered, their faces grim as they took in the sight of the Deathworlder forces below. No one spoke at first. They were all thinking the same thing. How had they come to this point? Kayla turned to her council, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "We have no choice but to meet them. They are here now, and we must make contact. Perhaps we can still convince them to leave, or at the very least, make their presence less overwhelming." "But they won't leave, Kayla," said another council member, a taller Zontar named Thalen. "They will take what they want. You've seen their ships. You've seen their soldiers. This isn't help. It's a military occupation." "We don't know that for certain," Kayla responded, though her own heart was uncertain. "We must try." The Zontar leaders left their hall and began the long walk toward the landing zones. The air felt heavy with tension. Every step felt like a step toward an unknown future. No one knew what to expect when they finally came face to face with the Deathworlders. As they approached the landing site, the sight of the Deathworlder soldiers became even more imposing. The Deathworlders were massive, towering over the Zontar with their heavily armored bodies. They wore suits that seemed to pulse with life, dark metal gleaming under the harsh sunlight. Their eyes were cold, calculating, and they moved with the precision of machines. There was no hesitation in their movements, no sign of mercy in their expressions. The Zontar leaders stood before them, feeling small and fragile in comparison. The Deathworlders' leader, Captain Varric, emerged from one of the massive ships, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the area. He stood tall, his dark armor reflecting the sun's rays, and his gaze was sharp as he surveyed the Zontar before him. "Welcome to your world, Zontar," Varric's voice boomed, carrying across the landing zone. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent shivers through the Zontar leaders. "I trust you know why we're here." Kayla stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. We sent the call for help. We did not expect you to arrive with such power." "We don't offer help the way you expect," Varric replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "You called for assistance. We came. You will survive, but it will not be on your terms. You asked for survival. We will give you survival, but it comes at a cost." The Zontar leaders looked at each other, their hearts heavy with the weight of what was being said. They had asked for help, but they had never expected the price to be so high. "Then, we are at your mercy," Kayla said softly, bowing her head. "Do with us as you will, but save our people." Varric's gaze softened ever so slightly, though his expression remained cold. You made the right decision, Zontar. Survival is all that matters. But remember this, the galaxy is harsh, and there are few who can survive without the strength to fight. From this moment forward, your world will be changed. With that, the Deathworlders moved in, their ships landing deeper into the planet's surface. The Zontar, though fearful, knew that their survival depended on this new frightening alliance. There was no turning back now. The Deathworlders had arrived, and the Zontar's peaceful world would never be the same again. The first strike. The Zontar had never known such fear. Even as the sun rose over their once serene cities, there was no peace to be found. The Deathworlders, with their overwhelming power and cold demeanor, had established themselves as the dominant force on the planet. The once tranquil streets, where Zontar children had played and families had lived without fear, were now filled with the heavy presence of the Deathworlder soldiers. Their massive, armored forms moved through the city, exuding an air of utter dominance. Captain Varric stood at the helm of his flagship, his eyes fixed on the Zontar cities through the view screen. The fleet had landed, and the time for waiting was over. It was time to act. The Zontar had called for help, but the help they had received was not the gentle, peaceful assistance they had envisioned. The Deathworlders were not here to be friends. They were here to ensure survival by any means necessary. For the Zontar, the weight of their decision was becoming unbearable. They had summoned this force, hoping for rescue, but now they were beginning to understand the true nature of what had arrived. The Deathworlders had made it clear from the beginning. Survival came at a price, and that price was becoming more evident with every passing hour. In the central hall of Zontar's largest city, the council members had gathered once more. Kayla, the elder councilwoman, stood at the front, her hands clenched tightly together. She had known the Zontar were a peaceful people, but she never imagined the kind of brutality they would be exposed to. They had asked for survival, and the Deathworlders had given them that, but they were also asking for something else. Submission. Kayla, I don't think we can live like this, Corin said, his voice tinged with frustration. Look around us. These Deathworlders are everywhere. They move in and out of our cities without a second thought. It's as if we're no longer in control of our own world. Kayla's gaze was heavy. She had seen it too, the oppressive presence of the Deathworlders in every corner of their cities. The once peaceful and harmonious Zontar had been replaced with something far darker. And now, it seemed the worst was yet to come. We have no choice, Kayla replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. We called for help, and the Deathworlders answered. But we must find a way to navigate this, find a way to survive without losing everything we hold dear. Before Corin could respond, a sudden alarm blared throughout the city. The ground shook violently, and the lights flickered. From the windows of the council hall, the Zontar saw the sky above them darken as more Deathworlder ships began to move. Is it another attack? Corin asked, his voice rising in panic. No, Kayla said, her face pale. It's the Vrox. The Zontar had been preparing for the inevitable invasion by the Vrox for weeks, but they had never imagined they would face the threat with the Deathworlders in control of their cities. The Vrox, a race of savage conquerors, had been closing in on Zontar's system for months. Now, they had arrived. The Deathworlders had prepared for this. As the first Vrox ships appeared on the horizon, the Deathworlder fleet began to move into position. Captain Varric's voice rang out over the communications system, cold and commanding. All units, prepare for engagement, he ordered. We do not wait for the enemy to strike. We hit them first. The Zontar watched, wide-eyed, as the Deathworlder ships launched from their landing zones, massive warships that seemed to blur with the sky as they made their way toward the incoming Vrox fleet. The Zontar had never seen anything like it. Their planet had never known true war, and now it seemed as though their peaceful world was being torn apart by forces they could never have imagined. Captain Varric stood at the center of the control room, his eyes sharp as he watched the battle unfold. The Vrox, though fierce, were no match for the Deathworlders' superior technology and combat experience. The Deathworlder ships moved like shadows, quick and deadly, launching precise strikes against the Vrock ships. The skies above Zontar were filled with explosions and flashes of light as the two fleets collided in a display of chaos and destruction. On the ground, the Zontar huddled in fear. They had never seen a battle like this, and they didn't know what to expect. The Deathworlders were moving through their cities, maintaining a strict control over the environment. Their military presence was overwhelming, and there was no room for the Zontar to take action. Every decision was made by the Deathworlders. Every command was given by them. Kayla and Corin stood at the front of the council hall, watching the battle unfold in the skies above. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the city, sending vibrations through the walls. They were helpless, caught between two powerful forces. "I don't understand," Corin muttered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. "How can they fight like this? The Deathworlders, they're not even trying to save us. They're just fighting to win." Kayla didn't have an answer. She had thought they would be rescued, but the reality was far different. The Deathworlders weren't saving them. They were ensuring the Zontar's survival through sheer force. The price of survival had become clear. The Zontar would live, but their world would be forever changed. The Vrock's fleet was growing desperate as the Deathworlders unleashed wave after wave of destructive firepower. It wasn't long before the Vrock ships began to retreat, their once formidable forces crumbling under the Deathworlders' assault. Within hours, the skies above Zontar were clear, the threat of invasion gone. Captain Varek's voice rang out again, this time over the global communication system. "The Vrocks are defeated. Your world is safe, Zontar. But remember, survival comes with a price." As the Deathworlder ships returned to their landing zones, Kayla stood at the window, staring out at the now empty skies. The battle had been won, but at what cost? The Zontar were safe, yes, but their peaceful world had been forever altered. The Deathworlders had shown them their power, their brutality, and now the Zontar would live under the watchful eyes of these conquerors. The Zontar had asked for help, and the Deathworlders had given them what they needed. But as Kayla looked out at the vastness of the planet below, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The price of survival had been steep, and the consequences would ripple through the Zontar's future for generations to come. Unexpected alliances. The aftermath of the battle left the Zontar homeworld in a state of uneasy peace. The Deathworlder fleet had decimated the Vrock's forces with brutal efficiency, their superior weaponry and tactics leaving no room for retaliation. The skies above Zontar were calm once more, the smoke from the battle dissipating into the ether. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension lingered, one that had only grown since the Deathworlders' arrival. The Zontar were alive, yes, but their world, their way of life, was no longer their own. The Deathworlders had imposed themselves on the planet in ways that were hard to ignore. Their presence was everywhere, on the streets, in the markets, in every corner of Zontar civilization. They weren't just the saviors of Zontar. They were now its rulers. As Kayla, Corin, and the rest of the council met once more in their grand hall, the mood was somber. They had survived, but the cost was high. The Deathworlders had saved them from the Vrocks, but they had done so with a cold, calculating efficiency that made it clear. The Zontar were now under their control. "What have we become?" Corin asked, his voice strained with frustration. "We called for help, and now we're at the mercy of beings who see us as nothing more than a fragile species. We don't even have control over our own cities anymore." Kayla nodded but said nothing. She had hoped that after the battle, the Deathworlders would leave, that they would return to their harsh planets, leaving the Zontar to rebuild their lives in peace. But it was becoming clear that the Deathworlders had no intention of leaving. They had come not just to save the Zontar, but to impose their own rule. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the hall as the door swung open, revealing a figure that Kayla and Corin had come to both fear and respect. Captain Varek. He entered the room with the same commanding presence he had shown on the battlefield, his armor gleaming in the soft light of the hall. "We need to talk," Varric said, his voice low but firm. The Zontar leaders stood, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them. Kayla had spent years negotiating peace, forging alliances with other peaceful species. But now, facing the Deathworlders, the familiar tools of diplomacy felt useless. The Zontar were no longer negotiating with allies. They were negotiating with conquerors. "We are at your mercy, Captain Varric," Kayla said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded. "You've saved us from the Vrox, but you've also made it clear that we no longer have control of our world. What is it that you want from us?" Varric's gaze was unwavering as he looked at her, his eyes like cold steel. "You are weak, Kayla. Your people have never fought a war, never faced true conflict. But now you've seen what it takes to survive. I gave you your survival. I gave you your world back, but it is not free. It never was." Corin clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "You expect us to submit to you, don't you? To bow to your will, to become your puppets in exchange for our lives?" Varric didn't flinch. "I don't expect you to bow to me. But I do expect you to understand the reality of this galaxy. You can no longer afford to be naive. The Vrox were just one threat. There are many more out there, many more who would come for your planet. If you want to survive, you need strength. The Deathworlders can offer you that strength, but only if you accept our terms." Kayla's heart sank. The Zontar had never known such a harsh truth. They had always believed that their kindness and peaceful nature would protect them. But now they saw how fragile their existence was in a galaxy filled with dangerous, merciless forces. The Deathworlders weren't asking for subjugation. They were offering something far more dangerous. An alliance, one forged in the fires of survival. "And what are these terms?" Kayla asked, her voice almost a whisper. Varric's lips curled into a cold smile. "Training. Military training for your people. You will learn to fight. You will learn to defend yourselves. You will no longer be weak. You will become a force to be reckoned with. And in exchange, the Deathworlders will offer you protection. Our fleet will remain here to defend Zontar from any threat. We will teach you, and in return, you will stand with us, as equals." Corin's eyes widened. "You want us to become like you, to fight like you?" Varric's smile never wavered. "Yes, you'll learn that peace is a luxury, not a right. The galaxy demands strength, Zontar, and if you do not have that strength, you will perish." Kayla looked at Corin, and for the first time since the Deathworlders arrived, she felt a flicker of hope. There was no denying the fear that gripped her, but the reality was clear. The Zontar had no future without the Deathworlders. They had no way of surviving the dangers of the galaxy without becoming like those they feared. "We will accept your terms," Kayla said, her voice steady, though her heart weighed heavy with the knowledge of what it meant. "But we will not forget what we are becoming. We will fight to protect our people, but we will never lose sight of who we were. We will not let you turn us into mere warriors without honor." Varric nodded, a rare flicker of respect in his eyes. "Honor is for the weak. Survival is for the strong. But I understand. You will have your honor, Zontar, as long as it doesn't stand in the way of survival." The terms were set, and the alliance between the Zontar and the Deathworlders was forged. It was a bitter deal, one that left a lingering taste of regret in Kayla's mouth, but it was also a necessary one. The Zontar were alive, and now they would learn what it meant to survive in a galaxy that demanded strength. As the Deathworlders began their training program, the Zontar looked on in silence. The peaceful world they had known was slipping away, but they could not afford to mourn the past. They had to change. They had to adapt. The price of survival had been high, but the Zontar had no choice but to pay it. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and in this new harsh reality, the Zontar would have to fight to survive. The question now was, would they ever truly be able to reclaim their former way of life, Or would they forever be changed by the presence of the Deathworlders in their world? Only time would tell. The aftermath. A changed world. The days that followed the battle were a blur of dust, confusion, and an ever-encroaching sense of change. The Zontar had always been a species that thrived in peace, their every day dedicated to nurturing their planet, creating art, and fostering relationships with each other. But that world, the world they had known for centuries, was slipping away. In its place was something new, something dangerous, something forged in the heat of survival. As the Deathworlders began to implement their training program, the Zontar were forced to adapt. At first, the Zontar resisted, hesitant to embrace the violent ways of their new protectors. Kayla, the wise and elderly leader, had always championed peace and dialogue. She had been one of the strongest proponents for seeking help, but now she found herself confronting an uncomfortable reality. The peaceful existence the Zontar had once enjoyed was no longer possible. Their survival depended on learning the ways of war. And so, the Zontar began their transformation. The Deathworlders' methods were brutal. They trained the Zontar in combat, weapons handling, and strategy. The Zontar, once a race that had never raised a weapon in anger, found themselves wielding blades, blasters, and heavy artillery. They learned the harsh realities of survival in the galaxy, a survival that required power, strength, and the willingness to kill if necessary. Kayla, standing at the edge of the training ground, watched the Zontar youth struggling with their new lives. Their faces were filled with confusion and fear. They were being shaped into soldiers, not diplomats. Some resisted the training, unable to reconcile the violence with the peaceful culture they had grown up in. Others, like Corin, embraced the lessons, understanding that the Deathworlders' power was their only safeguard against the dangers of the universe. Corin, though still young and uncertain, had become one of the most dedicated students. He had quickly learned that the Deathworlders weren't interested in sympathy or hesitation. To survive, the Zontar had to adapt, and he was determined to be the one to guide them through this harsh new reality. But even he, who had embraced the need for change, couldn't help but feel a growing emptiness inside as he watched his people slowly abandon the very values that had defined them. "Do you think we can ever go back?" Corin asked Kayla one evening, after another long day of training. He was covered in sweat, his hands still trembling from the shock of firing a blaster for the first time. The noise, the destruction, it all felt so foreign to him. Kayla turned to him, her expression one of sorrow. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know if we can ever return to the way things were. Our planet, our way of life, is changing too quickly, but we have to be strong. We have to protect what we can." "Protect what?" Corin asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "We're becoming something else. The Deathworlders want us to be like them, cold, efficient, merciless. Can we still be Zontar if we lose who we are?" Kayla's eyes softened, but there was a strength in them, a resolve she had not known she possessed until the arrival of the Deathworlders. "We must learn from the Deathworlders, Corin. We cannot be them. But we must learn to survive, to fight when necessary. It is the only way our people will continue to exist. The Vroks, the Deathworlders, these are the realities we now face. We can still be Zontar, but we must become a Zontar that can stand against the darkness." Corin stared at her for a moment, then nodded. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. The galaxy had never been kind to the weak, and in a way, the Zontar had been lucky. They had avoided the chaos of the universe for so long, shielded by their peaceful nature and isolation. But that protection was gone now. It had been shattered with the arrival of the Deathworlders. Far beyond the Zontar homeworld, in the depths of space, the Deathworlder fleet continued to patrol, a constant reminder of the price of survival. Captain Varric and his officers watched over the planet like silent guardians, ensuring that the Zontar would not fall to another threat. They had given the Zontar the tools to protect themselves, but they had also made it clear that the Deathworlders would always be there, watching, waiting. The Zontar were no longer free. They had learned to fight, but at the cost of their innocence, their history, and their way of life. The once vibrant cities of Zontar now bore the marks of military presence. Watchtowers rose at every corner, and armed patrols moved through the streets. The peaceful parks, once places of reflection and joy, were now training grounds. Children who once spent their days playing and learning were now taught how to fight, how to defend their planet. Even the arts, once central to Zontar culture, were now overshadowed by the need for survival. Kayla watched it all with a heavy heart. She had seen the potential for peace in the Zontar people, the kindness that had once defined them. But that world was slipping away, replaced by something new, something that, in time, might look less like Zontar and more like the Deathworlders. In the quiet moments, when the training had ended for the day and the city was still, Kayla would stand alone, looking out at the stars. She wondered if her people would ever find a way to reclaim their identity, or if they would be forever shaped by the harsh realities of the universe. They had survived the Vrox. They had survived the Deathworlders' harsh teachings. But at what cost? The question lingered in the air. Could the Zontar ever truly reclaim their peaceful existence, or had they become something else entirely? A race forged by fire, tempered by the need for survival. A race no longer defined by peace, but by the power to protect that peace at all costs. And as the Deathworlder ships continued to patrol the skies above, Kayla realized the truth. The Zontar might never return to what they were, but in a galaxy filled with chaos, where survival was often the only true currency, perhaps it was enough that they would continue to exist, no matter how changed they had become.